Hello and welcome to the Meditation Conversation. I'm your host, Kara Goodwin, and today I'm joined by Greg Wieting. Greg is a healer who helps leaders and entrepreneurs heal the anxiety, depression, chronic pain, and trauma that they can't think or talk their way out of. He developed the framework he uses to help others through healing his own anxiety, depression, and chronic pain, which was rooted in trauma. This included unraveling a severe spinal curvature and standing 3 inches taller today. And I really can't wait to hear about that. That's remarkable. So, welcome, Greg. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thanks for having me, Kara. Wonderful to be here.
So, can we start by you telling us a bit about your journey and how you ended up in a position to help so many people with their trauma?
Sure. I was introduced to energy medicine kind of by chance. I have a dear friend who's a massage therapist who offered me a massage. This is 25 years ago. And I was living in so much chronic pain that physical touch just was too painful. I did
Oh
not
my
want a
God.
massage. So she said, "What about some Reiki?" and introduced me to energy medicine, which I had never heard of, but I had implicit trust in her, and jumped right in and realized I found something I didn't even know I was looking for. Just this lifelong holding and this chronic tension and pain just started to soften and melt, and I felt like I was able to catch my breath for the first time in my life. So that was pretty remarkable in just that one
Mm.
session. And so, when when I find something that strikes me like that, I jump in head first. So within a year, I moved to Seattle and I started studying Reiki for pretty much 4 years straight. And my teacher introduced me to meditation, which launched me to nearly a year in India. When I came back to the States, that kind of led to kind of studying yoga and Ayurveda. I started to kind of seamlessly piece together all of these practices. And when I moved to San Francisco, I was sharing these practices with a cohort, and one of my students was a therapist. And she said, "You're teaching trauma informed healing." And at that point, I knew I was healing my own trauma, but I didn't really have the framework for understanding trauma. And so she invited me to be her teacher's assistant at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where she was teaching trauma, so I can offer mindfulness based practices to help the students. And so that's where I started to develop kind of the trauma and neuroscience lens that I'm, now applying to the somatic and mindfulness based practices and the energy medicine that I practice and teach today.
Wow. Well, that's beautiful and really fascinating. I'm curious about how, for your on your own journey, if you want to talk about that, how the sort of trauma informed piece came into it, because um, with traditionally, like with Reiki, for instance, which you mentioned. You don't necessarily need to go in. There doesn't need to be a mental piece to it. It's really just around that flow of energy. So I'm really curious about the combination of that trauma informed healing and how that kind of worked for you.
Yeah, I had found even in the world of Reiki and energy medicine, there was a lot of practice that was not trauma informed. There
Mm.
was taking a deliberate action to cause a particular effect, to try to open up energy, to try to move energy, which isn't necessarily supporting the body's natural tendency to healing. It's trying to impose some sort of agenda on what healing should look like, or trying to direct the system towards an end goal. And
Hmm.
so, the trauma informed piece is really following the energy, right? Following the body's wisdom as opposed to directing it and guiding it. So, bringing more of that subtlety and that nuance to really honoring, each individual, and um, holding space to support them just where they're at, as opposed to, forcing them into a balance that they may not be ready to integrate. In in the healing world, I've heard the term healing crisis, and where people go through big shifts and big transformation, but it turns out to be what people then label as a crisis. And I look at that as healthcare mismanagement. I look at that as too much too soon, which is often what trauma is, a lived experience that's too much too soon for the system to fully be able to process, absorb, make sense of. And so I see a lot of
That's a
that theme.
fascinating way to think of trauma. I love that. Too much too soon.
And so I think that gets
Yeah.
reenacted in the healing space, right? I think as practitioners, we want to get results for our clients and our students, and we can use the power of our own will to move energy, um, and and that's not trauma informed, right? That can do more harm than good, although it can often kind of get big results more quickly. But are those results safe and sustainable, or do they, you know, create and do they destabilize our clients, which can actually make their healing, um, you know, a bumpier road than it needs to be.
So what does it look like in terms of, because it's, you're working in a space beyond the thinking and the talking. When you're working with people, it's like what they haven't been able to heal through their mental bodies or through like traditional talk therapy, for instance, or psychotherapy. So, can you talk a little bit? And maybe this is where you talk about Prisma, which is your framework for overlaying trauma, neuroscience, and energy medicine with somatic and mindfulness based practices. I don't know if that's where we want to take this to kind of dive into that more, or if there's a better way to kind of talk about how you're using energy medicine to go beyond what we can think and talk ourselves through, but also not. Um, it sounds like there's still an element to that. Does that make sense?
So I look at working in a trauma informed way, helping us make contact with our innate wisdom. So I'm not really focused on trauma as much as I help people heal it. My work is to just help people become more aligned with their own innate wisdom, which is a term in chiropractic. That innate wisdom is what heals a paper cut. It's what sends platelets and proteins and orchestrates all these biochemical transmissions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and when there's stress, when there's trauma, when there's environmental toxins and hereditary influences, our nervous system short circuits and we lose contact with that innate wisdom. So I look at healing as just bringing us back into contact with that innate wisdom. And that's where healing just happens. And so I look at, the body, the mind, and the spirit as a symphony orchestra. And so when we're in balance and we're experiencing health, all the different parts of the orchestra are in communication, and there's a musicality of being, there's a harmony and a balance. So that's between our hormones and our emotions and our thoughts, our memories, our muscles, our organs, our endocrines, our neurotransmitters, the ligaments, the tendons, on and on. And when the nervous system does short circuit, all of a sudden some of that communication starts to break down. And that's when we start to create a lot of noise, and the noise starts to express itself as our symptoms and our illness. And so, instead of trying to fix or heal trauma, we're just breaking up the noise. We're just addressing the breakdowns in communication, which then help us return to our natural state of wholeness. And when we kind of remember our wholeness, we've developed more capacity to then make sense of and metabolize, the traumatic imprints of adverse experiences, according to our own wisdom and on our own terms and in our own timing. So then healing is more of a happening as opposed to a doing.
Hmm. Okay. Well, so what did this look like for you in terms of your spinal curvature? Listeners of this show, and I think I shared with you kind of in our earlier communications. Um, well, anyway, listeners will know that my daughter has curvatures in her spine, so I always like that always catches my attention when someone approaches and has some sort of experience with something like that. So I'd be really keen to understand how that worked for you, because that's remarkable that you were able to unravel that curvature and which resulted in like a 3 inch difference in your height.
Yeah. You know, so prior to me discovering this body of work, I would go to other healthcare professionals that would
Hmm.
try to force my system into a certain balance, right? Let's adjust your spine to, straighten you out. And so it was like this top down approach trying to, direct my system into a balance that it wasn't ready to integrate. Right? It wasn't actually addressing, the curve in the spine was really just the tip of the iceberg, a symptom. And so if we're busy chasing, treating, or suppressing symptoms, we're we're going to have pain and symptom management at best. And certainly pain and symptom management are necessary at certain times in our healing. But they're not really addressing the causative root factors that are, beneath the surface. And so, for me, all of these practices, the somatics, the mindfulness, the energy medicine, were helping to look at, well, what's beneath this spinal curvature, right? Let's start to understand what are the factors that are holding the spine in this holding. Um, and while there may be some genetic piece, it's like the genetic piece is often kind of the flypaper for, trauma to latch onto, right? And so if there's already a predisposition towards some imbalance, then harsh lived experience can start to compound that. And so, for me, again, I look at energy medicine as helping to calm the cardiovascular system, regulate the nervous system, balance immune function or boost immune function. So, those three qualities of energy medicine alone are just really nourishing the body's innate ability to heal.
Yeah.
And the mind training that is mindfulness is helping us reorient our awareness from pain to possibility. And it's helping to dissolve identification with pain, right? So if we're wearing pain almost as a costume or a mask, and if we start to believe that we are that costume or that mask, it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy where we just become further embedded in that pain body. So the mind training is to zoom out and really observe the pain body, recognize that that is not who we are. And in that space, there's kind of a recognition of something that's perhaps more real, more authentic to who we are. And so as we reorient from pain, we can come into a place of full presence. And then the grip of the pain body, that was holding my spine, again, organized around trauma. So that was a lot of protection. That was a lot of guarding. That was a lot of hypervigilance, a lack of safety, beliefs that the world is dangerous and out to get me. So, I look at energy medicine and healing as really subversive. It's helping to dissolve these beliefs and these constructs of who we are and what we believe the world to be. And as we start to dissolve those constructs, how they have a grip on our body, starts to dissolve as well. The connective tissue and fascia is what holds the muscles and the bones together. And so, um, it also happens to be where we store memory, emotion, and trauma. So if we
Mhm.
can start to address the residue and the imprints of trauma that are stored in the tissues, that's going to help us clear up chronic inflammation. That's going to flush out the stagnation of emotion. I look at disease and illness as stagnation and health as movement and expression. So energy medicine, mindfulness, somatics help us kind of feel what historically was too overwhelming for us to feel, so we can start to take up residence and inhabit ourselves, our bodies, our life. And as we bring in more presence, as we are able to land inside our bodies, that allows a lot more agency, a lot more choice.
I love that. Speaking of all of that being stored in the fascia, the memory and the the emotion, how important do you think it is to consciously connect with the trauma? Meaning, how important is it to bring the actual memory to the surface? Or because there are some schools of thought that talk about it being, like, oh, you can actually, like, you can work at this at the energetic level and you don't have to go into the story. For example, you don't have to go back there and feel unsafe again, or whatever. But then there are other schools of thought that I mean, especially, talk therapy, for example, that's kind of the hallmark of it. It's like, let's uncover it and kind of get to it through talking, so that we can even figure out what it is, because it's something that we don't want to look at, through our conscious, we're suppressing it. We're choosing to suppress it. So what are your thoughts on that suppression versus, and dealing with it completely energetically, versus the need to remember?
Yeah. I think when we start to resolve it on an energetic level, it broadens our window of tolerance. So we have a greater capacity to be with what is. So
Mm.
then, if and when it is necessary to process it intellectually, we have the capacity to think about it without it flooding our nervous system, and without the reenactment, and without the overwhelm.
And
Um,
without feeling unsafe. Yeah.
Well, and I look at, that's the paradox of healing. We develop enough safety so then we can process what historically has felt unsafe. And that's
Hmm.
where we can hold paradox, where we can be with wounding that has been organized around terror, that has been organized around, that which we can't even name,
Hmm.
and also have the capacity to be okay. So deriving enough okayness to be with the terror that once would have been just too overwhelming to even touch or look at or name. And this is unique for everyone. I had a client that, in our first call, excuse me, had named, some of the early childhood trauma that was impacting them, and that was bringing them to, our work together. And months into our work together, they said, wow, I was just doing the dishes the other day and I had a completely different, like, relationship to those memories and to that person. And in our time working together, we never discussed that person or those events or that trauma. We were just helping them connect more to their innate wisdom. So now they have a different relationship to that experience. It's not
That
to
is,
say that now we don't talk about different behaviors and beliefs and identity constructs that have been organized around that wounding. But again, their body's guiding that process, right? So
mhm.
sometimes I'll be working, energetically, and a client will say, wow, I just had a memory that I have literally not thought of since the event took place at age 7. So sometimes the body's innate wisdom will surface a memory, but we didn't
Yeah.
go digging for it and we didn't pull it out. It's like their subconscious was able to bring it to consciousness. Everyone processes differently. So some of us process top down, where we actually need to make sense of things intellectually for us to then land in our bodies. And then others process bottom up, where we need to kind of feel our way through it in our bodies before the light bulb goes off in our brain.
Mm.
But what I love about And that's kind of what I think a model that traditional therapy would discuss. And what I love about energy medicine is that it helps us process multidirectionally. So we may process a memory stored in a body part, and then all of a sudden, we start to behave differently, or we start to have different thought processes, or we may shift a belief, and then all of a sudden the physiological function of an organ or the mechanical function of a joint starts to shift, right? Because that thought or that belief was actually impacting physiological or mechanical functioning. And
Yeah.
yeah, one of the, I think the value so many of my clients and students find in healing is that we'll have a session, and after our work together, I just encourage them to go live their lives and to actually not overthink our work together. And sometimes just to forget that they even, spent their time with me, just because the more we are, that innate wisdom that heals that paper cut, it heals that paper cut while we're having this conversation, while we're sleeping. So it's healing that paper cut without us having to think about it or analyze it. So the more we just get in tune and in touch with that innate wisdom, healing just happens despite us.
Mm. That's beautiful. Thank you for that. And you really have a way with words. Like you have a really, really gifted way of putting words together. I don't know if you've thought about writing, but I'm like really enjoying how you weave conversations. Very beautiful. Um, but also, what you're talking about is it makes me think of a personal kind of multidimensional or interdimensional experience that I had where because sometimes I will just have these kind of rather spontaneous kind of experiences. And one night it was seeing kind of my body or a human body as like and they were like it was comprised of slices, and the way it was like these all these slices of a human form all put together so it looks like one person. It was actually I was seeing it lying like horizontal, and I was laying down. I thought I was going to go to sleep, and then I started kind of not sleeping but journeying, let's say. And so it was like all these layers that were in that looked like one human form. And one of the realizations or the kind of wisdom that came through with that um, one piece was just that we are like all these versions of ourselves, and that even we're holding all of that within us. We're holding all of these different experiences that we've had across time, including potentially like past lives, future lives, and all of that, and it's all here stored in our human form. And I also understood, just like what you're saying with the fascia, I'm not sure I've heard that before, specifically with the fascia, with the memories and the emotions, and that we're holding that in the fascia. But I had this understanding that like I hold information in my body, just using me as an example, because I was like, I'm closest to me, I guess, but it was like, oh, I can think of something or someone, and then there's a place within me that activates because that's where I like store that person. And the same with memories um and strangely it was actually it happened to be my dad's birthday when this happened. And so it was like my dad flashed up, and I knew where in my body, I think it was like my arm, like my right arm kind of lit up. And it was like, okay, my dad's like, I store my dad in my right arm, for example. And then it was also like wolf came up at the same time, which is weird because I wouldn't consciously put those together, even though, I mean, my dad loves dogs. But I don't see him as like a wolf, like what I would, what we kind of, how we would maybe ascribe the characteristics of a wolf. I don't ascribe to my dad, but it was like, oh, I store wolf there too or nearby. So it was like this, and it was like, oh, and it was just what it was. It wasn't like, I mean, maybe there is meaning there, but it wasn't like that at that time. It was just kind of like, oh, there, that's near where I store wolf. And then I understood too, oh, I carry everything in this body. Everything has like a place where it's stored. And then I understood the importance of that things get stored there until I release them. And so it is through everything wants to be seen was how I was experiencing it, was that it can create blockages when we deny it or when we don't want to see it. And then when we do see it and we accept it, it opens it up, and then it can be released. But until we do come into acceptance, then we just hold it and it just waits until we, and like you're saying, kind of until it's time or until we're ready, until we have the capability to release it, to see it, to witness it and release it.
Yeah. The subconscious and the unconscious mind live inside the body, and all the different parts of the body are organized around a particular consciousness and particular beliefs, right? So, and we this is demonstrated in our language. We carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. So the shoulders are very much tied into the consciousness of responsibility. How we each relate to responsibility is unique, and the healing journey helps our relationship to that consciousness become more neutral. But for some of us, we may feel the weight of the world and we may feel burdened by responsibility, where others may feel very empowered by responsibility, right? So responsibility, can be neutral, but our lived experiences are going to then influence, our behaviors and our beliefs and the emotional residue that gets stored, let's say, in the shoulders, and on for every part of the body, right? Ankles are about decision making, knees are about taking steps forward. So, if we are storing the imprints of trauma and the emotional content and residue of traumatic experience in these body parts, it's going to distort not only their physical, mechanical, physiological function, the behaviors and beliefs organized around taking steps forward and decision making, are going to become compromised. So that's going to make it hard for us to, be decisive. That's going to be hard for us
Mm,
to take steps forward, right?
yeah.
And so that's the healing journey, is starting to really map the narratives we hold, right? The stories we tell ourselves.
Mm-mm.
And trauma will often, create a fragmentation in the storyline of our lives. And so healing is to create more of a cohesive and unified narrative, one that can help to uplift and guide us, right? One that can help to expand the aperture of possibility. Because, the lie of trauma is we can't, and it's organized around alienation, isolation, fear, and healing is around connection and possibility, and really psychological trust. And so much is possible as we start to develop that cohesiveness. And so, kind of back to your question earlier, sometimes that will, take us to unearthing a specific memory and speaking the unspeakable. And when we can name victimization, it can help us no longer be a victim, right?
Mm.
But that happens for each individual in their own time, right? If it happens at all, right? And there may be other folks that are able to process something more in the subconscious and no longer carry that. And it may not have to process through the conscious mind. And so there's no one right or wrong way. And
Yeah.
each individual's own innate wisdom will kind of um, guide that journey in a really personalized manner, that honors, what's, the unique makeup of lived experiences that are part of that person's, life story.
That's beautiful. I'm really curious to know your thoughts on the chemical imbalance myth. You say that the chemical imbalance myth is a dangerous lie. So I would love to hear your thoughts and experience with that.
Yeah. So, well, a lot of us, in our culture, we've been taught that chemical imbalance is what's creating a lot of depression and anxiety. I don't even like to use the term mental illness because I look at mental illness more times than not as just unresolved trauma. And there's so much stigma around mental illness. And so I like to flip the script on that. That what if anxiety and depression are actually a healthy response to an unhealthy world or a healthy response to unhealthy circumstance? Um, but if we're taught that chemical imbalance is what's actually creating anxiety or depression, and then we are given a treatment to treat the chemical imbalance, it really gets in the way of us understanding that unresolved trauma and the lack of a secure attachment are more times than not contributing factors to a chemical imbalance. So if we're taught that we can just treat the chemical imbalance with a medication without actually addressing these other contributing factors, it's going to develop a dependence on a medication that's just managing and treating a symptom without addressing, you know, the underbelly. And
Mm,
so, and further, it actually hasn't been proven that chemical imbalance does cause anxiety or depression. And so,
mm,
the research isn't there. So, I have a psychiatrist that refers patients to me. He was, treating one of his clients, and she just no longer needed medication. And he said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Well, I'm working with Greg." And to his credit, a lot of times I've seen clients who, have no longer needed medications. And oftentimes medical doctors will just say, "Well, it must have been a misdiagnosis." Right.
mm,
And to his credit, his, ears perked up, his eyes perked up, and he said, "Let me reach out to Greg to learn more about his work." And so he sends patients to me with PTSD and complex trauma because he's recognizing that his skill set is helping people manage their symptoms, which again is sometimes necessary, right? So I I think there's a time and a place for everything. I'm all for an integrative approach. And as much as I've helped many of my clients reduce or eliminate their dependence on antidepressants and pain meds and anti anxiety meds, many of my clients are also happy to kind of have a balance of medication while addressing and healing trauma. So it's not one or the other. I'm all for an integrative approach. I want people to find their balance that is right for them. Um, and yet, if we start to do a lot of this subterranean work to address, the subconscious and the unconscious mind and the impact of trauma, chemical imbalance will start to clear up. Hormonal balance will start to clear up. Immune function will start to become, um, you know, come online. The nervous system will start to land. Um, and as heart rate starts to, calm, we develop, more and more capacity to heal, and we just reclaim, more of our own. We just reclaim ourselves. And
mm.
so, in that sense, there's the body has a remarkable capacity to heal. Um, and again, sometimes medication helps us do that healing work. Sometimes it can get in the way. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah,
I love
so
that. Yeah. Thank you. That's really fascinating. I didn't realize that the chemical imbalance issue hadn't ever been proven. You hear it so much. There's a chemical imbalance. Yeah, I just kind of took it for granted. So thank you. So how can people find out more about you and working with you?
sure. Yeah, gregwhiting.com. You can learn more about my one on one work. You
And
can learn
that's
more about,
Wieting.
correct. Yep. And there's also a link there to prismamethod.com. And so, yeah, my online course and community is where people can learn kind of the trauma and neuroscience roadmap. I find a lot of folks, myself included, when I started, I was in therapy for years and I knew, I was on the right track, but I didn't really know where I was or where I was headed. And so
Mm.
having a map can be really useful to get your bearings straight. The seven Prisma pillars are kind of the drop pins on that map, which, yeah, really help us understand this trajectory from pain to purpose. And then the somatic and mindfulness based practices, to kind of use that same metaphor, I look at as kind of the GPS, and they're helping us do that mind training to shift from the limitations and the identification of pain to the expanded possibility of healing and health. And then the energy medicine component, that's really the vehicle to heal the subconscious and the unconscious mind, to regulate the nervous system, and help us land inside ourselves.
Mm. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Greg. Thanks for being here today. Thank you for all the work that you're doing to help so many people through their own healing of their trauma. It's so needed, and I really appreciate your approach. And I look forward to your book.
Thank you. Yeah, that's my online course. The workbooks in there, all the contents there. So it's just a matter of reworking it into a book format.
Mm.
Thanks for the encouragement.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.